So we now turn to a Q&A session. Maybe can everybody be on the screen? Yes. So everybody is coming back. So we have a couple of questions that relate more to the general literature that I can maybe ask Laurie first. If any other wants to answer, you are also welcome. And then I have myself some questions, and any question from the audience is still welcome if you want to ask them in the chat. So we had first. It's not really a question; it's rather a comment, but I can transform it into a question by Ola Wale Lawal, who is. I can hear myself. So, is it normal? No. There is an echo. No, it's fine. With asking whether we should use the term refugee, climate refugee instead of climate migration, because people tend to move within countries. The Olawale Lawal suggests that we should use rather the term climate migration. So I think, Laurie, you had an answer to this comment if you want to.
Sure. No, I really appreciate the question. Thank you so much. And you're absolutely right. I mean, the term climate refugee received a tremendous amount of critique from the research community. It's a misnomer, based on what we know empirically. I mean, we just saw it from several of these studies, right? That international migration is actually much less common than internal migration. So the political definition of a refugee is international migration, and for particular kinds of concerns, right? Persecution. And climate refugee doesn't fit under that rubric. So there was a lot of pushback on that, and it has implications. There's some really interesting papers actually written on how that term and the language we use has meaning, right? It has power. It has, these labels mean something in people's lives, and individuals who are not eligible for refugee status do not have access to the resources that refugees do through international protocols. So, I entirely agree with you. And it was part of what the research community, I think, really pushed back on when that alarmist term showed up in the popular literature. So.
Thank you, Laurie. So we also have a question by François Héran, which I think Laurie can answer, but also Flore or Päivi and Katrin, because I think this is a question that is relevant for all of you, which has to do with the data. Can you tell a little bit more about the kind of data used in all these studies? You have to match climate data with mobility or demographic data. What is the scale at which this matching is done? Do you need to geolocalize the data? And in sub-Saharan countries, the quality of the data is very weak. So how do you feel the gap for the time to have a time dimension that is satisfactory? Do you need to resort to modelization? And what is the time span that is needed to assess the correlation between climate change and population change? So these are very rich questions. So maybe, Laurie, you can start, and if any other of you want to add something, you are welcome.
Sure, I'll give a general answer, but yeah, I think you have three really great examples here of how people innovate in making this work. Is the sound okay? I saw some people. Yeah, okay, all right. So you're absolutely right. I mean, one of the big challenges, and I think something that held back migration environment research for so long, is that you need codes, right? You need to be able to put households onto the landscape in order to attach the environmental data to do these analyses. And, we're social scientists, right? And so there are privacy concerns. You can't identify a person in a place if it's going to breach confidentiality for the most part, right? So finding data that gives you a geocode that will allow for meaningful attachment of rainfall data, temperature data, any of the other things is a real challenge. So you've seen examples, and I'm sure the researchers can talk about it, of using census data. I use a survey called the Mexican Migration Project Survey, which allows for city level geographic codes. Some demographic surveillance sites allow for those kinds of codes, but it is a challenge, and it's something you have to really look for. Another thing is, what's the appropriate geographic scale for the environmental data itself? So how far away from the household does rainfall matter, or how close do you have to be? So that's another consideration. And then you also brought up the really important issue of timing. So I think one of the things that really challenges us as migration researchers, right, for the census data, Flore, I'd be interested if Molly was like that, right? If you have migration in a 5-year time window, in so many of the censuses, where did you live 5 years ago? So you compare the 5 years ago answer to the now answer, and if those don't match, somebody moved, right? But you only know that they moved within that 5-year period. So how do you attach your drought? What if they moved in 2003 and the drought occurred in 2005, but you don't have that precision as far as the timing of the move? So I think researchers get creative. Some of the examples I've done, some that I've read in others, is, what about linking temperature and precipitation for 5 years before the potential move, right? And so you have to sort of play around that and see what it is you're able to do to best simulate the connection that you're wondering is there. I think I'll leave it there. And if some of the other speakers have examples from their own work, because you have some great examples here.
Thank you, Laurie. Thank you for this answer. Flore, maybe do you want to give it a try as well? Yes, thank you.
Yes, sure. Yes, so data is a real issue, and especially as you have so many different types of migration that you would like to capture with a unique, survey design, and this is actually completely impossible, right? Because you have both permanent, long-term migration, you have very short-term migration, you have a long distance, short distance, you have people moving out, coming in, and circulating, and this is very hard to capture all these moves. But I think it's not necessarily a big problems, depending on, in a sense, if you want to assess the impact of climate change, this is a very long-term process, right? And so it's very likely that this very long-term process has both an impact on short-term circulation, short-term migration and circulation, but also on permanent and long-term migration. And this is what is actually captured by census data. So obviously, census data do not capture a lot of movements, but what they do capture is how some localities grow or grow more rapidly than others. And this you can use as a sign that some localities become attractive to people and some localities become unattractive and maybe uninhabitable for some people, right? And this is quite interesting if you want to assess the impact of these long-term process, which is climate change. Census data are not, the gold standard, especially as you may have, strong measurement issues. Some people that are not registered for some reasons, and another challenge is that census data are generally not available in a lot of African countries for different reasons, either because there is no census, and this is the case of DRC. I think the latest census, the only unique census was conducted in 1983, and you just have this only census. It's a bit different in the case of Mali because we were able to have access to the raw data, and we have 100% the registered individuals for 3 censuses, which is unique, I think. In some other countries, you have only 10% of the census data, so it much depends on the country. But obviously, I think the main limitation of census data is that most of the time you have access to only 1, sometimes 2 censuses, and that's it. So it's a bit short to do a nice analysis. So with regards to the second part of your question, which is having geolocalized data, this is clearly something that is needed. I mean, if you want to combine these population data with data on climate events, on environmental the environmental context, and so you clearly need to to geolocalize people. So this is crucial.
Thank you, Flore. Thank you. I don't know if Katrin or Päivi, you want to jump in to answer this question. Otherwise, I have other questions. So you
can
you can go ahead. Yeah, of course.
On the time scale, because I think François raised a very important point.
Okay, go ahead.
The problem is that typically to measure climate change, you need at least 3 decades of weather data. And otherwise, we can't assess any changes in the climate unless we have these several decades. And most of these studies that we have cited, all of us, they don't assess climate change. I mean, let's be honest about it. They do look at weather fluctuations and weather variability. And I hope I was clear about that this is what we are relying on in our study. We really are relying on these decadal fluctuations in weather to estimate responses in migration in the terms of immigration rates and urbanization rates. But what we get then is this response to changes in weather, and it's a very long conceptual change, mechanism to go to a response to climate change. And this is a big challenge, methodologically speaking. And we should really be aware of that. And I think now there are more and more studies relying on census data, like the study of on Mali that Flore presented has that advantage that it is looking at a long time span, and I know some other studies, but it's a huge issue. Yes.
Thank you, Katrin. Päivi, do you want to?
Yeah, I was thinking just to mention a couple of things about the survey data, which is very different type of data source from the 2 others that we heard today. From doing the one time off surveys, not really a problem. You just in a way you just go there and do your randomization and you are fine. The issues are the geocoding, because then you get the issue with the anonymity. So you need to offset your GPS locations. But the real issue comes when you would like to have a panel. A panel is what we need. It's like one time cross-checks and survey only takes you so far. What you really need is to be able to follow people over years, over many years. I'm not talking about like 2 years, what we plan to do. We just really hope that the panel that we are starting, we are able to follow these 400 people for many years and extend and expand to a couple thousand people if we get the funding, because that's what we really need, is individual and household panels to really understand what's going on and going beyond analyzing the effect of one hurricane. But we really need to get a bit further, like Katrin is saying. Now we are only talking about weather events, but what we really need is to understand what role the environmental change. That's the other thing. It's not about the climate change only. Like it's the whole package with the environmental change that we should be looking at, and not only the kind of the climate part of it. So, and then the tracing to people becomes a real challenge. So like in our study, we have literally 10 telephone numbers for each individual in our panel, because otherwise we will lose them. And it's actually a big issue to make sure that you can follow these people and these households over time.
Thank you, Päivi. Laurie, you want to add something or?
No, and it was so nice
No.
to. One of my questions for Päivi was how do you find migrants? So I would love to hear more about that if we have a moment. But I wanted to. Katrin has made such a critical point about climate versus weather, and if anyone out there wants to do this kind of work, one way that researchers have been dealing with that is we use a 30-year normal, which is the climate science's measure of what normal is at the moment. So if whether over the past several years, you can express it as an anomaly from normal. So while you don't have you're not modeling that whole period, you're modeling a time as related to that period, and that's one way to try. It's definitely not perfect, and it's really important to remember that this is weather, not climate. But that's one way that we try to kind of build in a longer point of view, even if you're not modeling that data specifically. But thanks for that point.
Thank you, Laurie. So I don't know if any of you wants to ask questions. I have a couple I would like to ask you if we have time. But I can give you the floor first if you want, or no? Shall I start? So I have a question on the alternative strategies that we have heard about in the presentation, diversification of the crops, or in a way. The liquidity constraints that has also came a lot in the presentation. So let me start with the alternative strategy. And I was asking this question to either Päivi or Laurie or both, or all of you, of course, so you can answer. But so I was wondering whether conflict would also be an alternative strategy to migration. And we know that weather shocks can induce conflict, and difficult climatic condition can induce conflict when there is a tension on the land, on water, etc. But in a way, migration may also allow avoiding conflict if there is a weather shock or a drought or whatever. And I was wondering if you could tell us your thought about that, and what this would potentially mean in terms of public policy as well. And I had another question which has to do with the liquidity constraint that we have heard a lot, that is impeding people in their willingness to move. We have heard it when Laurie showed us this table, which is very interesting, I think, with vulnerability, migration, and immobility that is sometimes forced because of the lack of income. And we have heard about it also in Katrin and Flore's presentations. So I was wondering what would be your take on the relationship with market failures, and notably the credit market failure. Of course, insurance market failure is obvious, but this is not what I had in mind. It's more credit market failures, and whether the access to credit and financial inclusion may be a way both to allow people to move, but also in a way to invest in alternative strategies like irrigation and diversification of crops. So what would you think not microcredit, but access to credit would have as an effect in terms of migration if you relate it to climatic shocks? So I was thinking maybe Katrin or Flore, you may want to answer this question. So who wants to start?
I can start with the second
thank you, Flore.
On liquidity constraints. So the question you ask is, what is your prognostic with regards? I mean, if you facilitate access to credit to people, would they migrate or rather invest locally? And I would say, well, I think it's highly context specific. On the one hand, it's also dependent on whether the locality in which these people reside is a locality with a tradition of migration, with a culture of migration. I think all these factors are likely to to enter into the story, right? So depending on the opportunities locally and depending on the migration networks, etc., I guess the response will be different. So there is this nice experiment. I'm sure you know it, which has consisted in providing little funds to people from in rural areas. I think the experiment was conducted in Bangladesh, and so the experiment consisted in giving a small stipend to people from rural areas during the dry season, and actually a lot of them use it to travel to the closest city, and actually their level of welfare much improved. I mean, in the treated arm, those who managed to get the stipend because they were able. I mean, it solved their liquidity constraint. Much of them were able to move to the city, and so their welfare improved. So I think this is an example of where lifting the liquidity constraints allowed people to move and to improve their well-being. But I guess it's completely context specific.
Thank you, Flore. Who wants to go ahead?
I can start on the topic.
Okay, thank you, Katrin.
And then maybe Päivi can add something, because you work, Päivi, on the reception of climate migrants. In particular, I guess you know more about that from Burma, in particular to Bangladesh. But for conflict, there are several interesting papers, recent papers, that try to link conflict and migration. And there are the two hypotheses, right? One hypothesis that's rather pessimistic, that says that these induced migration flows will lead to conflict in the destination countries because of crowding and competition for resources. On this global data, this has been rejected actually by recent papers, this hypothesis. And they have instead found evidence of the other hypothesis, which I think is what you hinted at, Lisa. That is that migration can work as a sort of escape valve. So the fact that countries then that have a higher diaspora, so higher network of migrants abroad, that should reduce the cost of migrating internationally, they seem to have a lower incidence of conflict. And in that, and then there are recent papers more related to political economy, notably by Michelle Baina and Chris Parsons, on exit and voice, that also relates to this idea of trapped populations that we heard a lot about in the beginning. So why do people stay? And in particular, in some of the small island nations that are under threat of being submerged from sea level rise. And they build this model based on Hirschman's exit and voice theory in political sciences, explaining that because of place attachment that Laurie talked about, they prefer to stay and choose this alternative strategy of voicing, protesting either to the local government or in international circles, as we know, through the Alliance of Small Island States and their very vocal activities at the Conference of the Parties to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. So this is very interesting work, recent work that addresses your question, I think.
Yes, thank you, Katrin, thank you. So I don't know, Päivi, if you want to add anything. Otherwise, Laurie has a couple of questions. So go ahead, Päivi. Go ahead.
So thinking about migration or migration mobility, I actually prefer word mobility because it's broader in scope and also includes the immobility. What they create might contribute to conflict, and then of course we have to think about the conflict at different levels. So many of these papers kind of look at the armed conflict, which is quite severe type of conflict, and which for obvious reasons doesn't occur that often, and in most cases has many different types of roots. But then what I think we should be focusing is the in the host communities, and especially within the, now I'm thinking about the within countries, because that's what we are doing in Bangladesh. So it's the short distance within country type of mobility where you have a host community. And as long as these mobility movements are not displacements and they are not at huge scales, at least in Bangladesh, people tend to move to people that they already know. So they move to their family, the place where their family members already live. So, and especially in homogeneous country like Bangladesh, where people share language, religion, and ethnicity. So, I mean, it's very unlikely that it will lead to some kind of a violent conflict. But yes, there can be tensions in the host community between the migrants, especially if they come in large numbers and all in very short period. Of course, there can be tensions, and those can embed the potential of use the potential of the migrants, the people that have to come, because those people come with different types of assets. They can be physical, they can be skills and that type of thing. And what is important is try to integrate the migrant people in the host community in such a way that they actually contribute to the community. And that also means that we need to think about the host population and how the attitudes within the host communities shape so that they actually as positive as possible towards the migrants that are coming. So at least in the cases like Bangladesh, I wouldn't be so worried about kind of the, things escalating to violent conflict because of environmental migration. It might be different in some other contexts, but what I think is important to what we should be thinking is that if these scenarios come to be like that, millions of people are moving. So what we really need to think, and what I think we are, as a researcher, we are not yet doing, we really need to start to think about what would be the best place for these people to go if it comes to the large numbers that we are talking about. So I think we should be looking at what would be the best way for people to move, and especially what would be the best places for them to go. And that would then include taking care of the host populations, because that's often I see in the international policies, and they talk so much about the rights of the mobile populations, but not about the rights and preparation of the host communities to receive these mobile populations, if this happens in the scale that some of these estimations show.
Thank you, Päivi. So, I mean, we can take a couple of minutes, Laurie, if you want to ask your question. We will.
Maybe
What?
I'll start with just one. So since
Okay.
we're going to run out of time, but before I ask my question, I wanted to say thank you and congratulations to the organizers. I think this has been a fabulous session, and I've really enjoyed hearing about these 3 studies. So thank you and congratulations. It's been really interesting. Yeah. So my question was for Päivi, and about, you had that finding that it was the lower income and the higher income that were more likely to move, leaving the middles. Can you help me think that through? What do you think is going on there?
Well, that's I'm so happy that we have the follow-up, because I think now we have to remember that those even our richer people are poor in our sample. So we are not really thinking about rich people. We are talking about the richer end of poor population. So I think those are the people that can move. They have the cash, they have the savings, or they have some other assets that they can move. My hypothesis for the poor of the poor is that what they are thinking, that they don't have no choice. That if there is a cyclone that comes, they just have to go. They might not have a choice. That's my hypothesis, that what's going on. But I would in the follow-up I would like to ask more specifically about whether these people that think that they will be moving, is it because it's involuntary mobility, what they're thinking.
So what I was thinking, right, the middle sort of might have a choice to go either way, but they choose to stay. I thought that was interesting. And I also was thinking about, even in your one study site, you filled in many of those quadrants, right, with the voluntary mobility, immobility, involuntary. It's all happening right there, which I also thought was pretty interesting. So thank you for your work.
Thank you. So I think we have to stop now because it's 7 o'clock. So let me once again thank the four of you for your contribution to this session. It was really interesting, and I'm happy to have met those of you I didn't know. I think this discussion could be continuing quite a lot. So I hope we will have other opportunity to go into more details into all these questions. But again, thank you, thank to the four of you, and bye bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.